Hey everybody, this is Samantha Claire Snyder. I'm a musician, a mathematician, and a storyteller, and this is my fantasy novel, The Map of Griffyngrein. Chapter 8. Hastily, they gathered up the gifts from the chest, and taking one last look around them, climbed down to the room below. They discovered that the piece of stone on which they had risen to the top had pulled a ladder up with it, followed by another stone that had replaced the floor of the column. The whole mechanism was created to allow whoever was able to access the top of the tower a safe way to come back down. They hurried towards the stairs and began their descent. They quickly passed King Norman, and then King Beryl, and the empty landing, and finally came to the bottom. Axeman pulled out his key and unlocked the door. He slowly opened it, applying his eye to the gap and scanning the surroundings. "All seems clear," he said. "Come out quietly. After I lock the tower, we've got to move as fast as possible. Follow my lead. We're going to look around a bit here and then head to the village to make sure he didn't go there. If he didn't, we'll send out a search party, despite the risk. Ranef is very important to us. We cannot lose him. Now come." They slipped out, and Axeman locked the door. Then they set out through the ruins, looking for any sign of Ranef. Jane glanced at Golgotha. The habitual grouchiness in his expression was gone. His face looked pinched. He was definitely worried. When they were sure that Ranef was nowhere to be found in the ruins, Axeman beckoned, and they moved swiftly towards the woods. It was now very late in the afternoon, and the sun was making its way towards the western tree line. They had entered the same path by which they had arrived at the tower, and were several hundred feet down it, when Axeman halted and held up his hand, listening carefully. They all stood silent, straining their ears, and became aware of a faint throbbing noise. It seemed to be coming from all sides, and it was getting steadily louder. Axeman turned. "We need to go back." "What?" "Get back to the tower. Fast." Their hearts thumping, the whole party sprinted back towards the ruins. The noise got louder. They knew what it was now, the sound of many feet marching steadily through the underbrush. They reached the ruins and rushed in amongst them. Once, Jason tripped on a stone and fell, his shield flying from his grip. It really hurt, for there were stones all around. His hands and knees got scraped, and one of the more jagged pieces punched him in the stomach. But he was on his feet again in a moment, fleeing from that ominous noise. Finally, they reached the tower. Axeman fumbled with the door. The others pressed their backs up against the wall and stared wide-eyed towards the woods. Whatever was coming was quite close now. After what seemed like an eternity, the door groaned open, and they all rushed inside. They stood, panting, in the dark room, while Axeman held the door open just a crack and peered through. They began to hear voices now. Rough voices, shouting, giving and answering commands. Once or twice they heard a nasty snarl, as if from some fierce beast. In a moment, Axeman shut the door softly and hastily locked it. He turned to look at them, and his face was grave. "It's the 6th Patrol. The Terrfungs have surrounded us." A little while later, they stood in the top of the tower, crouching behind the parapet and peering down at the scene below. 150 Terrfungs stood in a tight ring around the tower and its surrounding ruins. They were all armed to the teeth and were clearly well-trained, bold warriors. 100 of them were on foot. The other 50, who appeared to be of higher rank, were mounted on very strange beasts. These creatures were taller than horses, but shorter than camels, light brown in color, with large, hammer-like heads and sharp teeth. The strangest thing about them was their long bodies, with 3 pairs of legs. Each of the beasts bore 2 Terrfungs. The warrior on the first saddle held the reins and wore spurs. The one on the second saddle carried either a spear or a bow, in addition to his sword and dagger. The creatures had fiery, angry eyes, and chafed at their bits viciously. It appeared to take the full effort of their riders just to keep them from breaking away and causing havoc. "What are they?" Jane asked, wide-eyed. "They're Gahoras," Jerem said with a grimace. "They're fast, and they're carnivores." Stationed across from the door of the tower was the Terrfung who was clearly the leader of the patrol. "That's Goff Barthel," Axeman said, pointing him out. He was several inches taller than the rest. His face displayed a stern, carefully calculating intelligence and a commanding air which easily distinguished him from his troops. His garments were richer, according to his rank, and he wore a chainmail shirt under his scarlet tunic. Sheathed at his side was a long sword with a queerly shaped hilt, a deadly weapon in the hands of such a brawny and disciplined warrior. Jason glanced at his own sword, but shook his head. "I couldn't possibly fight him," he said, half to himself. "I don't even know how to use this thing." "If we ever get out of here, you will learn," Axeman said. That's a very big if, Jason said gloomily. One thing's for sure, we aren't leaving this tower while they're out there, Jerem said. We can't let them see us, Axman said. Whatever made them come, we have to hope that if they don't see anything unusual, they'll eventually give up and go away. Golgotha laughed cynically. So we're under siege, is that it? Pretty much. Jane sighed. I don't suppose King Orwin foresaw that we would be stranded in here, did he? It would be really convenient if he had hidden some eternally preserved food somewhere. Yes, a stock of bread and water would have been an excellent gift to include in the chest, Jason agreed. And maybe some beef jerky? There was a loud boom from down below. They rushed to the rampart and looked over as much as they dared. I hope what you guys said about the door was true, Jane moaned. We're about to find out, Axman said. A group of Terrfungs with a heavy battering ram was standing at the door. They were mustering their strength for another hit. The party in the tower couldn't help but wince as it crashed against the door again. But the Terrfungs staggered backwards, apparently meeting with no success. Once, twice, 3 times they repeated their blows, to no avail. Goth Barthel looked angry and shouted something to the ram bearers. Several more Terrfungs came to the ram and laid hold. Another group of Terrfungs brought around a strange device which they fitted over the end of the battering ram and hammered into place. It was a network of iron spikes, which, combined with the driving power of the ram, could surely destroy any wooden door with ease. Once again, they gathered their strength and charged at the door, while Jane, Jason, and the Griffyngreins looked on in frightened fascination. The ram struck the door a mighty blow, and there was the sound of splintering wood. They've broken it, Jane gasped. Jason clutched at his sword, and Jerem sprang towards the trapdoor with his spear in his hand. Stay, Golgotha said. Now would ye all just look at that? The tone of his voice made them pause in the middle of their alarm and look again. When they saw the true cause of the noise, they all laughed in relief. The battering ram was broken, and the chagrined Terrfungs were staring at the tower door in disbelief. The door's as good as new, you can be sure, Golgotha said. Thank goodness, Jane sighed. But we're still in trouble, Jason said. They aren't showing signs of leaving, and the fact that they're trying to beat the door down after all this time has to mean they think there's something or someone in here on this particular day that's worth the trouble. Surely they don't know about us already, Jane said worriedly. Maybe they're still after the Bondstone. Jerem shook his head. It beats me. It was now nearing sunset. The Terrfungs had given up on the door for the moment, and now appeared to be setting up camp, all the while keeping their formation around the tower tight. It was clear that they were going nowhere. Should I try to take him out with my ring? Jane proposed suddenly. No, Axman said. The ring would do some damage, but not enough, and not fast enough to stop them from taking cover. The Terrfungs must not know that we're up here, or we're done for. We've got to settle in for the night, Jerem said. Our only hope is in waiting them out. They sat down with their backs against the rampart, facing west, and watched the sun slowly set, staining the sky with fiery orange and dusky purple. Aside from the occasional growls of the Cahoras, all was quiet down below them. The birds had stopped singing when the Terrfungs arrived, but as the dusk closed in, a few piped back up with a strange, melancholy but gentle lullaby. 1 or 2 Terrfungs down below noticed it and wondered why there would be such noise, for their presence normally silenced bird song. But the little group huddled in the top of the tower listened to it quietly and felt as if they understood it. As it grew dark, the temperature, which had grown quite mild that afternoon, dropped again. Jane wrapped her blue cloak around her and found that it was as warm and soft as it was beautiful. Jason leaned his head against the rampart, realizing just how tired he was. It had been a long day. The morning chores on the farm in North Carolina seemed very far in the past. He also hadn't eaten or drunk anything since he had been in Ranef's home. He wondered where the old Griffin man was, and if he was all right. The sun disappeared, and the last color steadily drained from the rim of the sky. One by one, the birds hushed their song, and all was dark and still. Finally, Axman stirred and spoke quietly. Let's go down into the tower and get some sleep. They slowly picked themselves up and climbed down, closing the hatch behind them. There, the Bondstone illumined the room. It wasn't as blindingly brilliant as it had been during the test, but it now settled down to a gentle blue glow that was somehow very comforting to their tired eyes. Each of them picked a place on the stone floor to sleep. It was a hard and unforgiving bed, but they were all too tired to care much. The sword in its sheath, The shield and the book of healing were carefully laid out close by. After a moment's thought, Jane put her ring with the other things, for fear she would manage to trace the stones in her sleep and hurt somebody. Then she lay down, huddled up in her cloak. Jason folded his own cloak up and used it as a pillow. Axman lay flat on his back with his coonskin cap over his face. Jerem sprawled out near the doorway, half propped up against the wall at King Orowin's feet, one hand loosely grasping his spear. Golgith stalked over to the bondstone and climbed under the table, where he settled down and promptly began to snore. Soon, they all dropped off to sleep. Jane and Jason's first day in Griffyngrein had ended. What the next one would bring, none of them could tell. Chapter 9. They were awakened the next morning around 7 o'clock by the harsh blast of a Terrfung trumpet, which so startled Golgith that he bashed his head against the underside of the bondstone table, starting off the day with a volley of enraged exclamations. Reluctantly, they dragged themselves to their feet. Sleeping on the stone floor had made them stiff and sore, especially Jane and Jason, who both had taken a few nasty tumbles the day before. But their main focus this morning was their hunger and thirst, which had become quite severe. "If that stupid map hadn't brought us here, I'd be eating Mom's cooking at home right now," Jason grumbled. "Don't do that," Jane protested. "It's true, though." "Just shut up," she groaned, following the others to the ladder and dragging him by a sleeve behind her. They opened the hatch in the top of the column and climbed up into the open air, which was so sharp and cold that they were all wide awake in a moment. It was a dull and gloomy morning, and from the looks of the sky, it wasn't going to get any better. Observing the scene below them, they found that the Terrfungs had already risen and were variously occupied in tending to the Gahoras, repairing the battering ram, arming themselves, and, worst of all, eating breakfast. To the group in the tower, the sight of their enemies placidly consuming a substantial meal, all the while separating them from any prospect of breakfast or lunch or supper, was maddening. "Come away from there," Axman commanded after a few minutes, going back to the trapdoor. "We're only hurting ourselves." They left the battlements with a last vindictive glance. Their one comfort was that the Terrfungs obviously couldn't reach them, at least not with their battering ram. But they gloomily predicted that this siege would end badly. They tried to occupy themselves to get their minds off their troubles. Jerem, who never tired of studying the ancient history around him, wandered through the tower from top to bottom, examining its every feature. Jane sat down and began to look through her book of healing. Despite her concern about their predicament, she was soon absorbed in its contents, for it was a remarkable book, containing priceless knowledge about remedies and treatments for even the worst of injuries and ailments. The instructions ranged from simple herbal regimens to surgeries. For Jane, it was a treasure. Axman was talking in a quiet voice with Golgith. The ornery Griffin man seemed not to mind Axman as much as he did most hookies, and besides, they were trapped together. They might as well discuss a thing or two. Jason couldn't hear most of what they were saying, but he caught enough to know that they were deeply concerned about Ranef. Jason was looking closely at his magnificent sword and shield. As he absently gazed at his reflection in the latter, he found himself wondering if it was actually intended to be a mirror. It was polished so clearly and crafted so perfectly that it almost seemed as if the designer had cared just as much about its reflective qualities as he had its defensive capabilities. He also noticed how young, grubby, and worried the boy in the reflection looked. Nothing about him seemed the least bit imposing or warrior-like. The sword of the kingdom, glistening at his side, seemed to be pasted in from some different, much more glorious picture. Jason sighed, and shaking his head, was just turning away when something made him pause and look again. To his surprise, he didn't look too bad after all. In the shield, he saw a tall, broad-shouldered boy with a confident stance and a kind expression. Now he was confused. It was as if the reflection had changed. He didn't ever remember looking quite like that, although it was undoubtedly him in the mirror. And hadn't he seen practically the opposite just a moment ago? But no, never mind. The reflection was quite ordinary now, showing an ordinary teenager squinting back at him with a very ordinary expression. Jason rolled his eyes and put the shield down. Deprive a fellow of his food, and he goes all funny in the head. The time crept on. The morning was half gone when they heard shouting outside. Quickly, they climbed up and looked over the rampart. What they saw was both unexpected and horrifying. The Terrfungs seemed to have abandoned the repairs on the battering ram, and were dragging a small figure towards the tower. It was Ranef. He was struggling mightily, and though he was definitely not a match for them, he was putting up quite a good fight for his age and size. "What are they doing?" Jane gasped. "Nothing good, you can be sure." Golgotha looked as if he was about to jump straight off the battlement to reach Ranef. "I'll string 'em all up. Every single one of them, like a bunch of lanterns," he fumed. "Shh! I'm trying to hear what they're saying," Axman said urgently. Fortunately, Goff Barthel, who had a firm grip of Ranef's arm, was in a mood for shouting. When he spoke, there was no trouble hearing him. "Listen to me," he roared. "I don't have time for your tricks. Open the tower, old greenhead, or I'll bash your skull in." He shook and struck Ranef as he raged, and kicked him to the threshold of the tower. They could no longer see them without leaning too far over the rampart, but they heard the exclamations down below, and trembled, for they knew the Terrfungs' reputation. The military leader would not hesitate to use whatever means necessary to persuade Ranef. "Will he open it?" Jane asked. "He'll sooner die than let them in here," Axman said quietly. Jane groaned. "Can't something be done?" "Anything. We need Ranef. You said so yourself. This is all our fault." "Perhaps we should open up," Jerem said. "Axman, you and I and Golgotha standing in the doorway could take down a lot of them as they try to come in. Jane and Jason could stand behind us and use their weapons if we fail." "I'll be right up there with you," Jason corrected firmly, even as his stomach flipped. "No, slow down," Axman interrupted. "You know it's no use. Our most important job is to keep Jane and Jason safe, and to keep them a secret from the Terrfungs for as long as we can. You two are Griffyngrein's only hope. The whole 6th Patrol is out there. We don't stand a chance." "But Ranef—" "I know. It's terrible. But I don't know what we can possibly do. We'll just have to hope they'll give up." They crouched on the floor of the tower in a cold sweat. It was a horrible, horrible feeling to know what the Griffin man was enduring for their sake, and to be so utterly unable to do anything about it. After a while, Barthel did give up, but it only got worse. Furious, he dragged the battered Griffin man, whose strength was obviously failing, back a few yards from the tower door, with a new idea. Holding Ranef in a standing position, he shouted up at the tower. "I am giving this old sorcerer one last chance. Hear me, you there in the tower. If there is anyone in there, open the door quickly, or I will kill him. And if there's no one in there, I'll kill him all the same." "He isn't bluffing," Jerem said. "He'll kill him without blinking." Golgotha jumped up. "Keep the kids in here. For all the Terrfungs know, it's just me in here. I'm going out to slit the scumbag's throat." He dashed for the trapdoor. Jerem dove to stop him, and they rolled around on the floor, struggling madly. Barthel drew his sword. Jane choked back a scream. Ignoring everything Axman had said, she resolved to shoot the Terrfung as soon as he moved another muscle. She was not going to watch Ranef die. Tracing the stones, she put her fist on top of the battlement, and closing her left eye, took aim at the Terrfung's head. Axman saw her. "Jane," he said sharply, grabbing her arm. Barthel lifted his sword. The world swam before Jason's eyes. Suddenly, a great shadow rushed over them from the right, a breeze rippling through the still, stifling air. Barthel's sword clattered to the ground from his nerveless fingers. The tower trembled as the silver lining shot through it again. The bondstone crackled in the room below. All eyes turned to the sky. The great shape wheeled and swooped down on the 6th Patrol. Chaos ensued. Here and there pounced the dazzling figure, and the Terrfungs screamed in terror, fleeing for cover in all directions. Goff Barthel had long since disappeared into the woods. Queeshags were dashed against trees and flung into the thickets. Gahoras were swept aside by a mighty wing, as if they were toys. Armor crashed, weapons shattered, and in 5 minutes there was not a single living Terrfung to be seen. All that remained was the sound of their retreating footsteps in the underbrush all around. It was nothing like the steady, relentless march that they had heard earlier. This was the sound of disordered blundering, occasionally accompanied by a maddened yell of lingering panic. And soon it faded away. The onlookers in the tower stood there stunned, hardly comprehending what had happened, overcome with relief and a sense of joy and wonder. Jerem and Golgotha had stopped in the midst of their tussle and were staring with very wide eyes. Axman had let go of Jane's arm, which had dropped to her side. Jason had lifted his head and jumped to his feet. They were all gazing in the same direction. There, in the clearing, rearing on his powerful hind legs, with his great iridescent green wings outspread, his sharp talons poised in the air, his bright, pure white, feathered head and powerful beak lifted to the sky, and his noble green eyes flashing with the spirit of a conqueror, was a griffin, half lion, half eagle, but greater and more splendid than either beast could ever begin to be. No matter how many times Jason and Jane may have read about such a mythical creature in stories or seen portrayals of it in movies, nothing could have ever prepared them for what they now saw before them. Golgotha suddenly found his tongue. "Great Macindoff, it's Therum!" So it is, Axman said, beaming. Gogif suddenly realized that he was gripping Jerem's shirt with both fists, and that Jerem had a firm hold on his beard. He let go and jabbed Jerem in the stomach. Hands off, you oaf! It's all right now! He dove through the trap door, followed by all the rest, who went as fast as their shaking legs would allow. When they reached the bottom, they found, to their surprise, that the door was wide open. At the very presence of the beast, it had sprung open of its own accord, but no Terrfung remained to enter it. They piled out of the tower. Despite their joy to be out in the open again, Jane and Jason hung back a little, daunted by the size of the griffin, who was at least 9 feet tall when he stood on all fours, and was of a massive, brawny build. But despite the razor-sharp talons, the long lion's claws on his hind paws, and the curved, gleaming beak, the griffin seemed kind and friendly as he looked at them. Come on, Axman urged. He's all right. They approached the griffin. He was bending protectively over Ranef, who had crumpled into an exhausted heap on the ground. Greetings, Therum, Axman said, bowing. They all followed his example. Greetings, Hookie, he said, dipping his head courteously. We are indebted to you, sir, Jerem said. The griffin smiled and glanced keenly at Jason and Jane. I must get Ranef to a caretaker, and then I would like to talk further with you. Take him to Hooksterdam, Jerem said. He will be well tended there. We'll be there as soon as we can. With amazing tenderness, the great beast gathered Ranef's cloak around him and picked him up in his talons. With a nod to the others, he sprang into the air, and with a clap of his wings, he was gone. They all gazed after him for a long moment, and then looked at each other, dazed. But at Jerem and Axman's insistence, they gathered their wits and prepared to make their way to Hooksterdam. But aren't the Terrfungs sure to be around? Especially the 6th Patrol, Jane protested as they went back to the tower for their belongings. Jerem laughed. If any one of them dares to come near here after what just happened for at least a week, you can call me a Gahora. No, they're scattered far and wide, and the walk to Hooksterdam will be no more dangerous than usual. Taking a last look at the bondstone, which was still flashing brilliantly, they left the tower, locking the door carefully behind them. Then they turned their faces towards the place that would be their home for many months to come, the village of Hooksterdam.